The story of D.B. Cooper is the kind of tale people love. It has everything. A mysterious man in a suit and sunglasses. A bomb in a briefcase. A hijacked airplane. And a daring escape. A leap into the night with $200,000, never to be seen again. For decades, it's been America's greatest unsolved mystery. People imagine him on a beach somewhere, sipping a drink, having gotten away with it. The perfect crime. But there's another story. It's less glamorous. It's not a movie plot. It's colder, darker, and much more likely to be true. It's the story of a man who made a fatal mistake. A man who didn't escape to a new life, but fell to a sudden, violent end. This is the theory that D.B. Cooper died during the jump. It's not about a criminal mastermind. It's about a desperate man, a terrible storm, and a landscape that doesn't forgive. And to understand why this is the most probable answer, you have to go back to that night. November 24th, 1971, Thanksgiving Eve, a man calling himself Dan Cooper boards Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 in Portland, Oregon, heading for Seattle. He's quiet, sitting in the back of the plane. He orders a bourbon and soda. Shortly after takeoff, he passes a note to a flight attendant. She ignores it at first, thinking it's just a man's phone number. He leans closer. "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." And so it began. He was calm, polite even. He showed her the inside of his briefcase, a mess of wires and red stick. He wanted 4 parachutes and $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills. When the plane landed in Seattle, his demands were met. The passengers were released. A new flight crew came on board. Cooper then gave his final instruction. He wanted the plane to fly towards Mexico City, staying below 10,000 feet, with the landing gear down and the wing flaps at 15 degrees. This kept the plane flying slow, around 200 miles per hour, somewhere over southwestern Washington. In the middle of a raging storm, D.B. Cooper did what no one had ever done before. He went to the back of the Boeing 727, lowered the aft stairs, and jumped into the freezing black night. That's where the legend begins. But it's also where the reality of his situation takes over. The romance of the story fades when you look at the facts of the jump itself. It wasn't a clean getaway, it was a suicide mission, whether he knew it or not. First, let's talk about the weather. This wasn't a calm, clear night, it was a vicious Pacific Northwest storm. The pilots were flying on instruments because visibility was so poor. There was heavy rain, which at 10,000 feet would have been sleet or freezing rain. The temperature outside the plane was about 7 degrees below zero, but with the wind chill from falling at over 100 miles per hour, it would have felt like 70 below. Cooper jumped wearing a business suit, a trench coat, and loafers. He was not dressed for a leisurely skydive. He was dressed for a business meeting. Hypothermia would have set in almost immediately. The cold would have been shocking, debilitating. It would have been hard to think, hard to control his own body. The force of the wind hitting him as he left the plane would have been like hitting a wall. It would have ripped the money bag from his hands unless it was secured perfect. It would have torn out his clothes. Just the physical shock of stepping out of a warm cabin into that environment is hard to comprehend. Then there was the darkness. It was around 8:13 p.m. There was no moon. There was thick cloud cover. He jumped into absolute, total blackness. He would not have been able to see the ground. He wouldn't have been able to see his own hands in front of his face. He was falling blind into a void. For a skydiver, even an experienced one, this is a nightmare scenario. You can't judge your altitude. You can't prepare for landing. You are completely at the mercy of gravity and the wind. And the parachutes. He asked for 4. He took 2 main parachutes and 2 reserve parachutes. This has led some people to believe he was an expert, that he knew what he was doing. But his choice of chute tells a different story. He took a civilian parachute for his main and an older military-style parachute as his reserve. Crucially, the reserve chute he was given was a dummy chute used only for classroom demonstrations. It was sewn shut and couldn't be opened. But Cooper didn't take that one, he left it behind. Still, the chute he did jump with was not a steerable modern parachute. It was a basic round canopy. It was controllable, but only in a very limited way. It was designed to get a soldier to the ground, not to allow for a soft, precise landing in a chosen spot. He was basically a rock being dropped from the sky. So you have a man, poorly dressed, jumping into a freezing storm in total darkness with a parachute that offered little control. The chances of him even surviving the fall were slim. The wind sheer from the storm could have easily collapsed his parachute. He could have been knocked unconscious by the initial blast of air. He could have simply frozen to death on the way down. But let's imagine he did survive the descent. Let's say he managed to open his parachute and wasn't killed or seriously injured by the fall itself. Now he faced his second, and perhaps bigger, problem: the terrain. The area where the FBI believed he landed is some of the most rugged, unforgiving wilderness in the entire United States. This is the Cascade Mountain Range in southwestern Washington. It's not a gentle rolling landscape. It's a dense wall of Douglas firs, deep canyons, raging rivers, and steep, rocky hillsides. Even in broad daylight, in good weather, it's a difficult place to navigate. For a man landing in the dark, in a storm, the odds of survival were close to zero. The most likely landing scenario would have been in the trees. The forest there is incredibly thick. He would have come down through the canopy. If he was lucky, the branches might have slowed his fall. More likely, he would have slammed into them. A broken leg, a broken arm, a punctured lung, any of these injuries would have been a death sentence. Getting tangled in the parachute lines suspended high up in a tree was also a very real possibility. In the cold and wet, he would have died of exposure within hours. If by some miracle he missed the trees and landed in a clearing, his situation was not much better. He would have been soaked, freezing, and disoriented. His loafers would have been useless in the muddy, uneven ground. He had no survival gear, no map, no compass, no fire starter, no food. He was a man in a business suit, in the middle of a vast hostile wilderness. He would have had no idea where he was. The nearest road could have been 5 miles away, or 50. And it wouldn't have been a straight line. It would have meant crossing rivers, climbing ravines, and pushing through thick underbrush, all in the dark. A simple twisted ankle would have been the end. This is the core of the Inhospitable Terrain Theory. It's not one thing that killed D.B. Cooper. It was everything. It was a cascade of failures. The terrible weather, the dangerous jump conditions, and the brutal landing zone. He didn't stand a chance. The wilderness likely claimed him that very night. For years, this was just a theory, a logical one, but a theory nonetheless. The biggest argument against it was the lack of evidence. If he died out there, where was the body? Where was the parachute? Where was the money? The search was one of the largest in American history. The FBI and the military scoured the area for months. They used helicopters, planes, and hundreds of soldiers on the ground. They found nothing. No trace of the man, his gear, or his money. This led many to believe he must have survived. He must have landed safely, met an accomplice, and vanished. But the search area was huge, hundreds of square miles of dense forest, and they weren't even sure they were looking in the right place. The flight path was only an estimate. Finding a body in that kind of terrain is like finding a needle in a haystack the size of a state. And nature is very efficient at reclaiming things. A body in a wet, forested environment decomposes quickly. Scavengers like bears, cougars, and coyotes would scatter the bones. Within a few years, there would be very little left to find. A skeleton broken and spread over a wide area would be nearly impossible to spot from the air or even on foot. The nylon of his parachute would last longer, but covered in dirt and leaves, it would become part of the forest floor. The briefcase would rot away. The only thing that would likely survive for a long time would be the money. And then, in 1980, they found some. A young boy named Brian Ingram was on a family vacation, camping along the Columbia River at a spot called Tina Bar. He was digging in the sand to build a fire pit when he found something strange. 3 bundles of rotting $20 bills. They were bound with rubber bands, just like the ransom money. He and his family turned them over to the FBI. The serial numbers were a match. It was Cooper's money. About $5,800 of it. This was the first and only piece of hard evidence ever found that was directly linked to the hijacker. And its location told a powerful story. Tina Bar was miles away from the most likely jump zone. So how did the money get there? The bills were not in neat stacks. They were worn and degraded, and they were layered with sediment, suggesting they had been washed downstream. The FBI's hydrologists studied the river systems. Their conclusion was that the money had likely been washed down the Washougal River, which flows into the Columbia River upstream from Tina Bar. And where does the Washougal River originate? It flows right through the heart of the rugged forested area where the FBI believed Cooper had jumped. This discovery was a game changer. It strongly supported the theory that Cooper never made it out of the woods. If he had landed safely, why would he just leave a chunk of his money behind in a river? It makes no sense. But if he died during the jump, and the money bag was ripped open on impact, or as he fell through the trees, the story clicks into place. The money, along with his body, landed somewhere in the Washougal River watershed. Over the years, a few bundles were washed away by rain and melting snow, eventually making their way down the river system until they were deposited in the sand at Tina Bar. The rest of the money, and Cooper himself, is likely still out there, or what's left of them, buried under years of forest debris, scattered by animals, or at the bottom of a river. The Tina Bar money suggests that the searchers in 1971 were looking in the right general area. They just didn't get lucky. The forest is too big, and what they were looking for was too small. So why does the legend of Cooper the folk hero persist? Why do people still want to believe he got away with it? Part of it is the romance of the story. We love an underdog, an anti-hero who sticks it to the man. The idea of one guy outsmarting the entire government and FBI is appealing. It's a modern-day pirate story. He was polite, he didn't hurt anyone, and he vanished like a ghost. That's a much better story than the reality of a man dying alone in the cold. People have also tried to paint Cooper as an experienced paratrooper or an aviation expert. They point to his knowledge of the 727's aft stairs and his specific flight instructions. But this knowledge wasn't necessarily that specialized. Aviation magazines at the time had detailed articles about the 727. Someone could have learned just enough to sound convincing without actually being an expert. In fact, many of his actions suggest he was an amateur. An experienced skydiver would never jump in those conditions. They would know that jumping into a storm at night is suicide. An expert would have asked for a proper helmet and gear, not just cash and parachutes. He also didn't seem to notice that one of the reserve parachutes he was given was a non-functional training model. He happened to choose the working one, but it seems to have been a coin toss. This suggests he wasn't a paratrooper who could spot the difference. He was just a guy who knew he needed a parachute, but not much more. His plan had a certain cleverness to it, but it was a plan full of holes. The biggest hole was the exit strategy. How did he plan to survive the jump and get away with the money? The legend assumes he had it all figured out, an accomplice waiting with a car, a hidden cabin, a perfect landing zone. But there is zero evidence for any of this. It's pure speculation, wishful thinking to make the story better. The simplest explanation, the one that fits all the available evidence, is that there was no brilliant exit strategy. The jump itself was the plan, and it failed. He was a man cornered perhaps by debt or some other crisis, and he came up with a desperate, high-risk plan. He might have thought it was possible, he might have underestimated the wind, the cold, and the wilderness. A little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing. He knew enough to hijack the plane, but not enough to survive the escape. Over the years, dozens of men have been named as suspects. There was Richard McCoy Jr., a Vietnam veteran who pulled off a similar hijacking a few months later, but was caught. There was Sheridan Peterson, a former smoke jumper with extensive parachute experience. There was a long list of others, each with a piece of the story that seemed to fit. But the FBI investigated and cleared almost all of them. No suspect has ever been definitively linked to the crime. And maybe that's because we've been looking for the wrong kind of person. We've been looking for a survivor, a criminal mastermind living under a false name. We should have been looking for a missing person, a man who disappeared around Thanksgiving of 1971. A man whose friends and family never knew what happened to him. He could have been anyone. An office worker in over his head. A veteran down on his luck. A quiet man who simply snapped. The identity of D.B. Cooper remains a mystery. We may never know who he was. But what happened to him is a different question. The evidence points overwhelmingly in one direction. He didn't escape to a life of luxury. He didn't beat the system. He stepped out of an airplane into a freezing black storm. He was torn apart by the wind. He was lost in the darkness. He fell into a vast and unforgiving wilderness. The money he stole was scattered, his body broken. The forest took him. He became another one of its secrets, buried under a blanket of pine needles and time. The legend of D.B. Cooper is a ghost story. The man is long gone, likely dying within hours, if not minutes, of his famous leap. The only thing that truly survived that night was the story itself, a story that is far more exciting and far more romantic than the cold, hard truth. The truth is that you can't beat the laws of physics. You can't beat a winter storm at 10,000 feet. And you can't beat the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. D.B. Cooper tried, and he paid for it with his life. The mystery isn't where he went. The mystery is who he was before he made that final fatal jump.